What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Steve Taylor from SteveTaylorRD.com. He is also the registered dietitian for Team 3DMJ. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, man. Thank you so much for coming on. To kind of set up the framework for this discussion, considering your very diverse background. I mean, you work with bodybuilders at 3DMJ. You have your own private practice where you work with all sorts of people within the general population looking to lose weight, improve their body composition, improve their energy and performance, just all facets of goals that you work with. So we're going to kind of be touching on multiple factors to consider when it comes to developing a sustainable approach for weight management. So to kind of cover some basic definitions before we dive down this rabbit hole, when it comes to sustainable habits or promoting long-term behavior change, we commonly hear these terms such as flexible and rigid restraint. Can you kind of define these for us and what the main differences are?
I think the easiest way to look at, let's say, like you said, like rigid restraint is just traditional dieting, where the person they have the same 15 to 20 foods. They have these very specific rules. They eat every 3 hours. They maybe don't have, dairy, or they don't have carbs. They don't have whatever it is. But it's just the simplest way to put it is just like your traditional dieting mindset. And then probably the simplest way to explain flexible dieting is just you're able to be flexible with your diet. So you're able to kind of make your diet, meaning like the foods that you eat, match your preferences and your lifestyle. So if you're someone who doesn't like to eat 6 mini meals a day, you can eat 3. Or if you're someone who, likes to have carbs, you could have a higher carb diet. So that's probably the simplest way to put it, is like you can be flexible with your diet and you can make it match your preferences and lifestyle.
Perfect. And with that being said, in regards to flexible restraint, most people are going to be familiar with this concept that has become popularized nowadays, and that is flexible dieting. So it's this understanding that as long as you equate for certain basic principles, such as the energy content in your diet and perhaps macronutrients such as protein, which have, a larger effect on energy expenditure through the thermic effect of food. When we account for these things, there are a variety of dietary approaches and foods that can work to facilitate body composition goals. Now, with this movement, there's kind of been some backlash towards these traditional, more rigid strategies. You can think of old school bodybuilders who, only eat 8 different foods and they stick to those same foods every day. And this whole flexible dieting thing has been very liberating for a lot of people, understanding that there are no good and bad foods and that they can eat things that are quote unquote fun and still achieve their goals. But when we look at the extremes of flexible dieting and the extremes of rigid restraint, personally, I see some big similarities, even though you might see people on either side of the spectrum arguing with each other. And what I see there is the first thing that comes to mind is potential micronutrient insufficiencies or just not a well-balanced diet. You kind of see, again, in this rigid restraint paradigm, you see the same 8 foods, which you're just bound to be lacking in some vitamin or mineral when your food selection is so narrow. But at the same time, you see with the flexible dieting crowd, maybe they're just drinking whey protein shakes to cover their protein needs, and then they're not eating any fruits or vegetables, but filling up their daily calories through things like Pop-Tarts, which is, the traditional example people like to use. So not really a question, but just some thoughts on these perhaps glaring differences on the surface between these strategies when there might actually be some similarities when you apply the extreme versions of these. What kind of comes to mind when you're comparing these different dieting approaches?
Yeah, and I think you already hit on one of the big ones, which was just like you said, the potential for micronutrient deficiencies. That was well said, and I have nothing to add to that. I think another big one is stress. So on like the rigid side of stuff, the stress comes from basically clock watching all the time, constantly having to restrain yourself from like eating foods that maybe you would love to have. the stress that comes from following all those guidelines. And on the flexible side of stuff, the stress that can come from having no structure. So it's like I remember me, like when I first kind of, got into, I guess you could say, a more flexible eating strategy. With too much flexibility, I was spending a bunch of time and energy like making decisions all day long. Like I had no basic framework to work off of. So I was constantly like, when should I eat this? Or it's like there was just too much time like making all these decisions since I could make all these decisions. So I'd say that's one that sticks out to me, is just the stress that can come from being too flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that comes to mind, which I would be curious hearing your thoughts on, are this potential for disordered eating. So a lot of people might say that if your meals are too structured or your foods are too similar and you restrict certain foods, this will likely lead to some disordered eating, perhaps some binge eating behaviors, because due to this restriction, you're going to crave these foods and you're going to want to consume more of them. But at the same time, I feel like from a behavioral or psychological perspective, when it comes to a very flexible approach where you're saving all of these calories for one huge hyperpalatable meal at the end of each day and then restricting at other times of the day to make that meal happen, I feel like there's some issues there as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. Like you said, it's almost like what we're talking about is like either one, like a more like traditional type of fat loss, or a more flexible approach taken to the extreme can cause issues. And like you're saying, I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with where like when we start, they're following some sort of like fasting protocol, or they basically what you just described, they save 80% of their calories for like one big meal at the end of the day. And it leads to them basically for the other period of the day, they're hungry and they're constantly thinking about this meal that they're gonna make. And then basically as soon as they finish that meal, they're like stuffed and uncomfortable and bloated and they feel terrible. So it's like they're constantly swinging between these two massive extremes. And like to your point, just the thought that goes into that, like it leaves them thinking about food all day long. Which is kind of, again, parallels what we see in kind of like the traditional rigid dieting, where since you're constantly clock watching and can't have certain foods, again, kind of food can kind of always be on your mind, because like maybe you love chocolate, and like if you would just allow yourself to have a little bit of chocolate, then that would go away. But because like you can't have chocolate, or you have to eat every 3 hours, it again just keeps those thoughts in your head all day long.
For sure. And from what I've seen from some of the literature, it seems like generally these more flexible eating patterns or attitudes towards food tend to produce better long-term outcomes. And with that in mind, I find the extreme dieting patterns and the N=1 experiences of people who follow these things to be really fascinating. So what comes to mind is people within the carnivore tribe or stringent followers of the ketogenic diet. We would think that on paper, at least for most people, it would be difficult to follow one of these approaches for a long period. But I feel like I consistently see people who have used these things for multiple years on end, and they find great success with it. Can you kind of touch on why that might be, or yeah, or the types of perhaps personalities or psychological traits which may predispose someone to success on one of these more extreme diets in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways we could take that one. I think the first thing is like, how do we define long term? So it's like you're talking about a few years. Well, I mean, if we're talking about like a lifetime, 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know. So, I don't know how long term someone would be able to follow something like that. But again, like going back the other way, which you originally kind of were taking the conversation, these people who can do something for a few years that seems on the outside is pretty rigid. How are they doing it? I mean, one, it could come down to preferences. So like maybe there's someone who, like, if let's say they're following like a ketogenic diet, maybe there's someone who really just doesn't like carbs. They don't feel like they need a lot of carbs in their diet, and so it's not that hard for them. Another one is I think motivation plays a big factor in it. So again, like if somebody can be super motivated for something for even a couple of years and be able to adhere to something, but like maybe that motivation will like eventually dissipate, and then we won't see the adherence that we currently see. And another way I think you were looking at this is like just talking about it's almost coming down to like just it's almost like maybe the benefits of like some sort of like restraint or some sort of rigidity or something. And I have seen that helpful in my practice. Like my typical go-to approach is just a balanced diet. So just a high protein, moderate carb, moderate fat, get your fruits and veggies in. Just because I've seen like that tends to work best for most people. And it also tends to fit best with most people's life. But with the rigidity like in that is I've still found like some people it's helpful to do certain things like not like if somebody wants to create, let's say, the habit or the structure of like not snacking between meals and stuff, like that could be an example of like, being a bit rigid of like, hey, I don't like snack between meals and snacks, but that it can also be helpful because then it's kind of, they know like, I don't need to like graze all day long. I'll just kind of eat when I'm, planning to eat, and I'll be fine with that. So I've seen that's helpful. I've also seen it's helpful just to like not keep certain foods in the house. So again, like just another example of like maybe you could classify it as being a bit more on the rigid side, but from my perspective, it's like it's just making it not harder than it needs to be. Like just if versus just having a bunch of ice cream in the freezer and like making the person like restrain themselves from having it or limiting it or like portion it out or whatever. It might just be easier just not to even have it there. And then if they feel like ice cream, they know they can go have it because they're following a more flexible approach. But to get it, then they actually have to leave the house and go get it, which a lot of times would discourage the behavior in the first place. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but those are kind of my initial thoughts on the kind of where you were originally going with that.
Yeah, no, they absolutely answer that question. And I find these practical strategies, which are more from a rigid stance, are pretty interesting because we are both formally educated in nutrition. And I don't know about your schooling, but I know for mine, the idea of completely removing any food is ludicrous, and everything can be consumed in moderation. But truly, what I've found, and you kind of touched on this in your own practice, is that it seems like some people just have a difficult time moderating. And, they don't want one donut, they want the half dozen. And for them, they might find it easier to just not have any donuts at all ever than expose themselves to one, because it just drives these cravings for more. Could you kind of expand on in your own practice what you found with this and how people tend to respond to these rigid strategies?
Mm-hmm. And to your point, like it kind of plays off like where I was just kind of just going like my approach, because that does come up a lot where somebody's like, hey, like if I have donuts, like I can't just have one, I have six. And at first I try to like, our ultimate goal is to kind of break that mindset, because it's kind of like they have that attitude because that has been the pattern in the past. At the same time, I might ask a question like, well, it's like, if you could break that habit, would you want to break that habit? Would you want to be able to just have a donut in moderation and be cool with that? And then if they're like, yeah, that sounds great, then it's like, okay, we're on the same page. It's like, now it's like that, just because that's been the previous pattern, like now we can work towards like creating a new pattern. And so like with that, like with all those, like those, I guess those tempting foods where people feel like they don't have control, it's just the way I put it is like, don't keep them around you. Don't keep them in the house, like I was saying, but at the same time, like also don't feel like you can never have that food again. Because that is like what you're saying is like, it's easy for me just not to have donuts at all because I can't have donuts. And like, again, I still see like, yeah, that would work in the short term, but like eventually you're going to want a donut again. Like eventually, like we all want a donut again. And so it's like, and then I feel like if this whole time we've been building this mindset where it's like, I'm just never going to eat donuts again in my life. And then let's say 6 months from now, they end up being somewhere they have a donut. Well, now they feel like they messed up. So it's like, that's where I'm like, that's why I don't want any of that. It's just like, no, like you can have whatever food. At the same time, like don't make this process any harder than it needs to be. So we just won't keep it at home. But if you're out and stuff, like, and you have a donut, like it's whatever. And just know that, just kind of apply that rule of like being consciously like working towards something. So now that we've clarified that, hey, I would love to get better at being able to eat in moderation, like when you're put in a situation where you can now practice that, practice it. Try just to have one or two. Because I think that's I don't know. I think that gets skipped over a lot. It's just the like developing, like what I tell people is like we're developing a new lifestyle. Like we're not dieting, we're developing a new lifestyle, and it's a process. So it's like we're not robots. So like I can't just like tell someone like, hey, here's your new attitude. Like let me just have you download that. And like now whenever you see a donut, like you only have one. It's like almost every time, like when I'm working with someone to develop a new behavior, create a new attitude or whatever it is, it's always a process to get there where it's like they'll make it happen sometimes and then sometimes it just won't happen. Like they will like overindulge and have the 4 or 5 donuts. But like as long as they recognize that like it is a process and it's not going to be an automatic thing, I think that lets them give themselves some grace and just kind of keep working at it. And just knowing that like now that we've said, hey, I'm going to eat donuts in moderation, it's not just going to be like that every single time for the rest of your life. Like you probably will overeat on donuts again, and that's cool. Like we're just trying to get it to where it's like the majority of the time now. It's like, just having a donut or two and being cool with it.
Fantastic. A couple of the points you raised there makes me kind of think about this paradigm of dieting and weight maintenance. And again, kind of referring back to formal education and nutrition, most things are considered fad diets, right? So the ketogenic diet is considered a fad diet, and the premise behind that is because it's not a long-term approach. But in opposition to that, I would say that dieting shouldn't be a lifestyle. You shouldn't be trying to lose weight forever, and as such, the approach you take to diet, while it would be useful to be able to develop some habits there to ultimately use as you transition to weight maintenance, it doesn't have to be the case. And you can follow something that is not sustainable in the long term to lose weight, but then transition to a weight maintenance period where you develop these more sustainable habits and things that are conducive to this long-term lifestyle that you mentioned. What are your thoughts about this relationship between dieting and weight maintenance, and should these things always look very similar, or is there different approaches that can be taken depending on the individual?
I would say both. So
Okay.
I could speak from like I guess my practice is I try to have it be where the majority of the stuff that they're learning and their basic framework is going to apply to how they're going to live long term. So it's like basically the numbers might change, like the amount of calories they need to eat, the number of fruits and veggies, the number of steps they need to walk. But at the same time, like they still have developed like the habits that align with how they're going to keep living. So basically, I guess I could say like one example, like we've been talking about being restricted with food. Like I don't ever have somebody in the short term cut out a certain like macronutrient or do anything really wonky with their diet that they don't plan on doing long term, just because I don't see the carryover in that. But to your point, like let's say they're going through a fat loss phase and it is just harder. Like that's where they might need to develop like a temporary habit where it's like maybe they need to walk, 16,000 steps a day. And like, yeah, they're not going to be doing that forever. But for right now, they need to build out this section of their day where they're doing like this, hour and 15-minute walk or something just so we can get that caloric burn in. Or pushing back. Again, I'm not big on like long periods of fasting, but let's say it is during a fat loss phase. And let's say we just move breakfast back like an hour or two, like just a little bit. Like, yeah, maybe that isn't a long-term thing, but it's just a temporary thing to like help make the fat loss process easier. But again, it's not to the total extreme where it's like now, hey, we follow intermittent fasting while we're doing this process, and then at the end we're just going to go back to like eating whenever. So I do try to have it mimic what their life is going to look like in the end as much as possible. Because like my goal, and this is I guess the analogy I use to describe it, is I kind of want it to be where it's like when they hit their goal, like when we get there, it's almost like there's no like finish line that they break and like, oh, okay, I'm done. But it's more just like they get there and they like look around, oh, cool, I'm here. And like they're already living the life, 80, 90% to how they're going to keep living it. So yeah, I guess I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's like I try to mimic what it's going to look like long term as much as possible, but there are maybe a few like little things we might throw in there that just apply to the fat loss phase.
Yeah, no, it certainly does, and I think that was much needed context to this conversation, and that ultimately, when you transition to weight maintenance, the more strategies that you can keep from your preceding diet, the better and the easier it's going to be, rather than having to rewrite the entire playbook. I really like your example about potentially utilizing time-restricted feeding while dieting, and that's just like this one little variable we're tweaking temporarily because it's conducive to this very specific goal at this very specific time.
Yep, and it's to a small degree. Like we're talking about pushing like a couple of hours, but like I still want people to develop the habit of like eating every 3 to 5 hours. I still want them to develop the habit of building all their main meals around protein, fruits, and vegetables. Like I still want all the basics to be there, but then like you said, we might just throw in this little strategy that's just specific for this fat loss phase, but it's like the core is still there. So that way, like when they get to maintenance, they start eating breakfast again, but it's just earlier in the day, but the breakfast is still similar to their breakfast. And yeah. And at the same time, like the process, like developing the attitudes we want them to have. So like back to the donut thing, like the whole time we're like doing this like fat loss phase is cultivating those new attitudes that, I want them to have or that they want to have. So it's like correcting that, like you say, that donut challenge or whatever we want to call it, like along the way versus like losing all the weight and then trying to like, okay, now you can have donuts again. Like, see, it's like that kind of, again, that's not really, I would rather just like, hey, no, like, let's actually eat the donuts like occasionally during the fat loss phase. This way you're already used to that. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In specific reference to the time restricted feeding thing, and this will transition nicely into kind of the second part of this podcast. What's really interesting about that is that it seems like in the research setting, when all you do is tell people, hey, let's push your breakfast back, 1 to 2 hours, and let's bring your last meal of the day up 1 to 2 hours, and that's it. They're not asking people to track or to change their food choices or anything, but just having a slightly more narrow feeding window. It tends to result in weight loss in most people most of the time, and which can be pretty useful because tracking isn't necessarily for everyone. But I do think it is at least beneficial for everyone to gain some experience tracking, just to, see what a real portion size for their body should look like. So with that being said, do you have clients track most of the time, or is it usually just in the initial stages? Do you think everyone should track for a certain period?
So I will say, unless I'm working with someone who has a history of disordered eating disorders, something along those lines, I do like to start off with a period of tracking. Because like you were saying, you get so much out of it. You learn about portion sizes, you learn about food, like just the awareness that it gives you about like your eating habits. And I mean, a lot of times, like kind of my first step is like, hey, there are no targets, but just track your calorie intake and eat X number of fruits and X number of veggies. And just like, and I'm sure, you've seen this, heard of this, had this happen as well, is like just the fact of like tracking and being aware of what's going on, like reduces calorie intake. So yeah, I do like to start people off with that foundation, where it's like they learn all that stuff. And I always say from the beginning, is like, this is for us is like training wheels. Like we're doing all this stuff this way. It's like you do learn about food. Because it's like at the end of this, like I want you to be at a place where it's like, you can look at a meal and have a rough idea of how many calories are in that meal. And also that means something to you. Because it's like if somebody's never tracked before and somebody's like, oh, that meal has 1,500 calories. Well, that number 1,500 calories doesn't really mean anything to that person because they don't know. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a lot. Holy cow, 1,500 calories. But they don't know what that means for them. But if they know to like maintain their weight, they need to eat about 2,000. Now all of a sudden they're like, shoot, that's like 75% of my day. That is a lot of food. Vice versa. It's like with the, I guess, like the stuff that's not like micronutrient dense, like a donut or something. They can see like, oh, that's only 200 or 300 calories. I'm allowed to have 2,500 calories in a day. I'll be cool with just that one donut. And so it also gives like freedom in that sense. So yeah, I do love to start people off with a period of tracking as long as it's appropriate.
Do you have any minimum duration you would recommend, or is it just kind of seeing how the client's doing with that? And some people need a little more time than others to kind of learn these fundamentals in nutrition.
Yeah, it's hard for me to give just like a broad stroke guideline, like, hey, everyone should track for X amount of time. I know, but it is helpful to have something to start off of. I don't know. I mean, I think like a minimum of 4 months would be cool. I kind of like my program it depends on the person, but it's about a year for a person to get through the full program. And so typically, at least for the first like 6 months, they're tracking, like when someone works with me. Um, Having said that, like along the period where they're doing this like tracking, we'll also like start working in days where they're not tracking, where they get to just lean into the habits and like practice like using the knowledge they've acquired. So it's like even in that 6 months process, like, maybe in months, 4 and 5 and 6, like, hey, just track 5 days a week at this point. Or hey, don't track on this day. Or like we might start playing, or like, hey, let's go a week without tracking at this point. So I do like play around with not tracking during the process. This way they have experience with it. But yeah, I do like to, I would say with my program, like 6 months at least typically is where someone's doing it. Just because that gives them enough time to like go through a lot of different situations, to try to know what it's like to track at different restaurants. It just gives them a lot of experience. A lot of stuff happens in 6 months.
Yeah, very cool. I think that's a great idea. Before covering some bigger ideas, something very, very specific with what you just said, I want to kind of dive into further. And you mentioned how within this long-term plan, you're going to start incorporating some days within the week where the individual doesn't track in order to kind of potentiate long-term not having to track. Which days do you start out with for not tracking? Because it's very common from what I see that people, they cross their T's and dot their I's during the 5-day work week. But when it comes to those 2-day weekends, if they're not holding themselves accountable, tracking or using some sort of mindfulness with their meals, they can completely go off the deep end and erase 5 days worth of work with 2 days on the weekend.
So at the point I start having people play around with not tracking, it's once they've developed a structure, like once they have like an eating structure. So it's like they kind of eat, like I call it a flexible eating routine. Like they kind of eat, about at this time during the day, throughout the day, they eat kind of these foods. They're familiar with like the calorie content of different foods. They've learned a lot already, and they already have habits in place. And they also have the motivation too, where it's like they're not at a place anymore where they want to just lose it on the weekends. Like I would never, like we're not at that. Like if we're there, then we're not playing around with that yet. So it's like basically like if we're playing around with not tracking, it's because like they're ready. Like they know their stuff, they have habits in place, and they like they want to keep moving in this fat loss direction. They don't really have the urges to go out and like, let's say, binge on the weekends anymore. Yeah.
Got it. So I think we would both agree that some sort of flexible strategy in the long term is the best way to go. But as you've outlined, it's definitely good to spend some time tracking and developing a structure before we get there in order to learn these fundamentals. Can you kind of outline perhaps what I might call the pillars of flexible dieting for us? So you mentioned that initially, as you transition to not tracking in the long term, you might start out with a couple days of not tracking. From there, where do we go? Do we only track calories? Do we track calories and protein? What does this road look like to, in the long term, just becoming a mindful eater who is able to sustain a relatively healthy body weight without having to track or do anything too restrictive?
So on the days that, and I guess I should clarify, like I guess my program as well. So like 99% of the people I work with, I mean, basically 100, like I don't have them track macronutrients anyway. It's calories and protein. So like kind of, I guess the next tier for us is just they're still like tracking their fruit intake, they're still tracking their vegetable intake, and they're still tracking their protein intake, but not their calories. So this way it's like they're still, are they getting their fruits, are they getting their veggies, are they getting their protein? But with the calories, like we're just kind of leaning into those habits they've created and the structure they have. And I've just seen like I almost always get like a little bit of like pushback on that to some degree because of like I think it's a lot of it's like fear based. So it's like it's almost like there could be this like dependency on like, hey, like the reason like I'm executing really well is because I'm using my Fitness Pal. If I wasn't using my Fitness Pal and logging all my foods, I don't know if I'd be able to like stay on track like that. But and it might sound like it contradicts what I said earlier, but it's not like they want to go off track. It's just they don't have the confidence to know that they'll be able to do it without my Fitness Pal. And so like in those situations, that's why it's like I don't like to do anything with calories. Like you know your stuff. Like let's just like lean into your habits. Let's track your fruits and veggies and protein, and let's ease into this. And I've just seen that the confidence that creates, like when somebody finally sees that they can do this stuff without tracking, like the confidence that comes from that and the freedom is incredible. Because it's like there's always, and even if it's subconscious at some point, like, you know, people can feel like I'm only doing this because I'm using my Fitness Pal or because I'm working with Steve. But it's like, that's why it's like by the end, like I don't want you to be in my Fitness Pal, and I like you're not gonna be working with me. Like like that's like the final phase is like being able to do this stuff solely you and not having to rely on other things, because like that is where the final like level of confidence comes from, of being like, no, I do got this. Like I am different. Like I have changed. But like to get to that level, like the only way that I've seen to really get there is to like not no longer have to micromanage and no longer have to like rely on someone else for accountability. Like you are your own accountability partner at that point, and you're no longer dependent on a certain tool to like keep you on track. So it's like that's the place I love to get to, where somebody just has the confidence of being like, I don't need another person, I don't need like an app to stay on track. Like I got this.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like when it comes to, you know, the general population at large, like we're basically building these habits and then just like leaning into them more and more over time, and knowing, you know, around when you eat, you know, typically how many meals, what those tend to look like. But when it comes to physique athletes, people who are a little more obsessive, who probably are coming out of the gate doing things like tracking the Splenda they put in their coffee. Is it a little more specific in the steps we're taking from, you know, say someone coming out of contest prep, who again is tracking everything to the gram, every half calorie? Do they have a more stepwise approach, or is it very similar to what you just mentioned for most people?
I mean, there can be more steps in it. It really comes down to them and how quickly they want to move or they're willing to move. So again, like I think a lot of it stems from like fear-based. Like if I don't do this, I don't track my Splenda anymore, then like I'm gonna lose all my progress. So like we can totally move in steps, and we do move in steps, but we don't necessarily like have to like be super like little bitty steps. It kind of depends on them and how quickly they're willing to go. I'm trying to think if there's something like a guideline or something I can give that would be something practical, like a takeaway someone could take away. But
if we take an individual who you assess and you determine it's very critical that we take them slowly from here, does that perhaps paint a more clear picture for you, where you think, okay, they're coming from tracking everything to the gram. Our next practical step, considering we need to take things slowly with them, might be just protein and calories, and then maybe just calories, and then maybe just focusing on hitting 4 protein-rich meals per day, and then like coming to a point where they use their hand perhaps as a practical way to just roughly eyeball portion sizes, and then just like sliding down this thing to becoming a mindful eater who doesn't need to track or pay super close attention to anything. Does that potentially ring any bells for perhaps like a very slow stepwise approach that someone coming out of a contest prep could take?
it does, and I guess so. For me, like if somebody's being very obsessive with tracking and they want to get away from it, but it's fear based, like you said, maybe the first thing where I'm going to bring everyone is like stop tracking macros, just track calories, just track protein, just track fruits and veggies. I'm basically going to bring everyone there, just because the carb and fat ratios just doesn't matter as much. You know, and especially if we're talking about after a competition, like where they didn't need to have maybe so many carbs to help them perform well, like now that they're eating more food. So basically anyone, I'm going to try to bring them to that point where they're just doing calories, protein, fruits, and veggies. And then what I'm also going to do probably is loosen up how they track their fruits and veggies. So it's like they no longer need to like weigh spinach or like weigh green beans, you know? Like we can be chill and just go off of like, hey, that's a serving of veggies, or that's a serving of fruit. I will move them there. And then I'll get feedback from them. Okay, if that's going well, then it's like, okay, let's start eating out a bit more and getting more comfortable with that. And or let's stop, weighing everything all the time. And then maybe from there it's okay, let's just track 5 days. Okay, now let's just track 4 days. Now let's just track 3 days, and just kind of progressively move our way to like less and less tracking.
Excellent. I think that's some very valuable points that a lot of people are going to be able to take away from this podcast. So kind of wrapping things up, my last question here, we've been talking a lot about tracking, potential for disordered eating, especially when it comes to physique athletes. Basically all of them track everything all the time, and perhaps there is a base of fear which is causing them to do that. But what I found with some individuals is that it's not really out of fear, but they basically track everything all the time because like it's just a habit, and they feel it doesn't negatively impact their life in any way. They might even say, I eat whatever I want. I just also happen to put it into my phone to see, what my nutrients come out to at the end of the day. And it really has nothing to do with the decisions I make. For those people, I still think a lot of practitioners might look at them and think to themselves that that's disordered eating, just the fact that they feel the need to track all of the time. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think for some people this is just a fine approach and they like to do it all the time? Or is it something that we need to try to get away from in the long term?
The way I see it is like, it's their life. So it's like, do what you want. Like, you don't listen to me. Like, I'm like, I'm my job to tell you how to live. Like, so it's like, yeah, like do what you want. If you like to track. Having said that, like, if you've been tracking for a few years and you're like, I just like to track, but you've been doing it for a few years, I would just say, just try not tracking. Because like, I know for me, like, I didn't realize that there was like another layer of freedom until I actually stopped tracking. Because I would say I was one of those people like to where it's like I was tracking, but I was just so used to it that like I didn't even really see it anymore. Like it was just like brushing my teeth. Like, oh, I'm like, it's just like one of the things you do. Like I just brush my teeth, I just track. And it was just like, I wouldn't say it was really disruptive anymore. Which is why I would have considered myself as someone who was like, oh yeah, it's not really disrupting, but I just do it because I've been doing it for 3 years. And I didn't realize the freedom that comes from not tracking until I actually stepped away from tracking. I didn't realize there was another like layer, or especially like the confidence boost that comes from that, or even some of the benefits that come from it. Like I know one of the things that like Eric and I have talked about are like a lot of times people track because they feel like, it leads to optimality. Like it's like if I track, that's better. But tracking can actually get in the way. Like let's say someone's deep into their off season or whenever, like if they're following these very specific, like predetermined targets, like that doesn't actually account for like what's going on in reality. So like, for example, let's say someone was like super active one day and they burned a lot of calories, but at the same time, they're trying to like adhere to like this specific calorie intake and then go train. Like they might have a crappy training session because they're underfed, where it's like if they'd listened to their body a bit more, they would have eaten a bit more food and now they would have trained better. And of course, like one session is not going to make a big deal, but if somebody's doing that for weeks, for months, for years on end, like that can definitely lead to like more like greater strength gains and greater muscle mass accretion. So it's one of those things where it's like just because someone's tracking it doesn't necessarily make it more optimal, and it can actually get in the way like once somebody is further like down the line. It's like if you watch any athlete who's like really good at a sport, like when they're actually like the best, like when they're playing the game, they're not thinking about the mechanics of like the movement anymore. Like they're just playing, and that allows them to be thinking about other things. So it's kind of like it's kind of like that with tracking your nutrition intake is like if you're not so, I guess, rigid and so locked into like these are my targets, it allows you to adjust your nutrition to match what's going on in your life, in your day, all that.
I find those comments to be quite fascinating, to be honest, especially with your own personal experience. I can definitely see how, for you personally, this tracking being the same as brushing your teeth, and then just not even realizing that there's this whole other level of liberation that you wouldn't even consider unless you took that step. And I think that's really important and probably a likely outcome for most people in this community. But you also kind of touched on the potential of becoming looser in your off season. And I know you've competed in physique sports, so feel free to touch on your own performance in the gym and improving your own body composition by following a looser approach. But I do find it interesting because I've found with a lot of people in the physique community, especially when it comes to the off season, these people are active. They possess a large amount of muscle mass, and a lot of people just have a difficult time getting in the calories they need to grow and perform optimally in a lot of cases. So I do think it's interesting that from your perspective, from what you've seen from coaching others, that their physique could potentially improve more than ever if they became a little less obsessive and then just kind of followed how they're feeling and what their body is kind of calling for.
Mm-hmm. And two things that come to mind, just to put a bow on something previously, is like, if someone loves tracking and like they're hearing this and they're like, yeah, but like I really don't think there's any more freedom. Like, I just know one of the lines that like I will always like share with people is like, well, it's like you can always go back to tracking. It's like how to track. So like, even if you think this is bunk and like you're like, nah, this isn't gonna make a difference. Like, you can always try it for 4 weeks if you want to. And then like if you're like, nah, like I still like tracking more, it's like you can always go back to tracking. And then to your point, you were talking about off season performance. I lost my second point. What was
So perhaps through following a looser approach in the off season, you could actually maximize your body composition outcomes because you're responding to variations in energy expenditure and you're feeding appropriately. But to me, this is almost counterintuitive to a degree because most bodybuilders need to shovel in large amounts of food to gain weight at a rate that is appropriate for their goals. So most people would think, they hear this and they're like, Steve, if I follow a looser approach in the off season, I'm just going to spin my wheels and not gain any weight for weeks on end. But it sounds like from what you've seen in your experience that that's probably not the case for most people.
Yep. And the biggest, I think that's a great point. Like, the biggest, I guess, distinction I'll make is like, it's not that we're not tracking anything. So it's like, I still suggest everyone track like certain outcomes. So it's like you're still tracking your training, you're still doing physique pictures, and you're still tracking your body weight. So it's like, as long as like those things are moving at a rate that like you want them to move at, it's like you no longer need to micromanage your nutrition because you're achieving your outcomes. Like, the nutrition, those specific targets were just to help you achieve those outcomes. But it's like, if you can achieve those outcomes without micromanaging, it's like you're good. On the flip side, like, let's say somebody is to your point, they're just like, the scale is not going up, their physique is not changing, they're not getting stronger. Well, that's where, okay, let's bring tracking in. Let's calibrate, let's recalibrate, let's see what your nutrition is like. Let's help you set up some new habits that are going to get you eating more calories, that are going to get things moving in the right direction. And then once like we've made this new, like, I guess, approach to their diet, this new calorie intake or whatever, once that becomes more automatic, more natural, then we can take tracking away again. So it's like, I'll always use like tracking like a tool like that. So if we're not achieving our outcomes, let's bring tracking in, let's recalibrate, let's set up some new habits. Once the new habits are rolling, okay, now we can take tracking back out and let's see if we can do it without the tracking. So I think that's the best way that I found to look at tracking, is it's just like, it's a tool that like we can always bring in and out. But the purpose of it is to hit specific outcomes. And if we're hitting those outcomes, the tracking was just a tool to help us hit those outcomes. Like, we don't have to track.
I think that sums up the points in this discussion perfectly, and that was a brilliant way to end the episode, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. This episode is loaded with practical takeaways that I know our listeners are going to benefit from. For everyone listening or watching, where can they go to support you, find out more about you?
Just SteveTaylorRD.com, or you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Steve Taylor RD. So
excellent. Everyone, check Steve out if you aren't already. I'll assume most of our listeners are quite familiar with you. But with that being said, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening, everyone.